The Nigerian Upstream Petroleum Regulatory Commission on Tuesday announced the outcome of the bidding exercise for the Nigerian gas flare commercialization program. It launched the program in 2016 to involve third-party investors or off-takers in harnessing gas released as a byproduct of oil production. The program was one of government's initiatives to drive the attainment of zero routine gas flaring by 2035 and net zero emissions by 2060 in the country, and also generate revenue. 42 companies and entities were deemed successful and issued letters of award out of over 226 companies that submitted bids. This morning, joining me for this discussion, I have Chukwuemeka Osuji, partner Olaniwun Ajayi LP. Thank you so much, Chukwuemeka, for joining us on the show.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
So if you're going to describe gas flaring, of course, it's the process of burning of natural gas that's released during oil production process, and it is both environmentally harmful and wasteful. So if we were to put it in quantifiable terms, now how much is being lost periodically in terms of gas flaring in Nigeria, and how significant is it for the private sector to invest, capture, and utilize flared gas?
Thank you very much. Historically, the numbers have been, frankly speaking, mind-boggling, and this is something that's been on for decades, to put it mildly. And we're talking of hundreds of millions of dollars being lost annually on account of the gas flares. The good thing, as you mentioned, is that we have, over the last decade, gradually reduced the rate of gas flare in Nigeria. So the numbers are a bit less than it used to be, but it's still huge revenue losses to the government, in addition to the implications for the environment. So we're thankful that this program has sort of kickstarted, and it will work hard towards curbing continued gas flare in the Niger Delta especially.
This program was launched in 2016, and it was meant to involve third-party investors or off-takers who are actually meant to harness the release of gas in the country. But then if we take a look at it, that's about 13 years ago that this program was launched. So were there initial challenges, or what were the reasons responsible for this program to have been initiated or launched at that particular year, but we're seeing a materialization in 2023?
Well, I think what happened is, of course, as you're aware, this program is one that requires third parties to come on site, to operator sites, and then set up their own infrastructure to gather this gas that would otherwise have been flared, and then utilize them. So that synergy, that collaboration, is something that needed to be carefully managed, because on the part of the operators who own the oil and gas site from which these gas flares are coming out from, they needed to be sure that the third parties that are coming on site ensure that they comply with all both environmental and operational requirements in those places. Even the commercial arrangements needed to be in place. But more importantly, the bankability arrangements for this gas flare program was something that was key, and a lot of stakeholders had been engaging with the Commission over the years. And pretty much that engagement was to make sure that the pricing is something that makes sense, and the arrangements are such that by the time you go and source for funding to invest in this venture, it's something that you're sure you can recoup over a while. So it was really about managing the synergy between the existing owner of the assets and the new entities coming on stream, as well as making sure that the projects were bankable enough to justify third parties investing in those projects. So I think it was working through that entire process that led to the delay. But thankfully, over the last couple of years, it was revitalized, and the Commission really then sped up things, and then we are where we are today, thankfully.
So looking at the projection of this particular program when it was initiated, the plan was to attain zero routine gas flaring by 2025 and the net zero emissions by 2060. Now, can that still be achieved in record time, looking at all the bottlenecks and, of course, the ratification of the processes? And does it actually need to take that long, owing to global discussions around climate change? And we know that that has been the focus for superpowers on the global stage.
Well, if we consider our antecedents and historically where we're coming from, then you could say that's sort of like a tall order. But I think the more important perspective is having timelines or goals is not necessarily about meeting it to the T. It's really about ensuring that you keep yourself, the rigor and the discipline of ensuring that each day, each passing year, a step is being taken in that direction. So I think even if we do not meet that goal, I hope we will meet that goal. But even if we do not meet that objective, that target that year, the important thing is to make sure that each year we are one step closer to that date. As long as each year we are one step closer to that date, then I think success is being measured. Yes, people might say we didn't get the exact targets, but to the extent, like I said, that we are one step closer each year to reducing those numbers, I think we can take that as success.
And let's further talk about the impact it might have on the nation's economy, of course, the sector. In furtherance of the Petroleum Industry Act 2021, this program was restructured in the third quarter of 2022 and relaunched to align with the provisions of the PIA, that is the Petroleum Industry Act. Now, can this initiative address the prevailing economic and operational realities of the oil and gas sector? Or should we prefer, or would you even prefer, a more robust approach to dealing with the issue of gas flaring and other issues attached to this sector?
Well, in my personal view, the issue of gas flaring, it's historically we had sort of started with the stick approach, penalties, then we then migrated to having the carrot and the stick approach, and now we actually pay more attention to incentivizing investments in that sector. And I think I like the direction we are heading, because what this direction will do will, first and foremost, encourage more people to invest and deploy resources in the midstream. Secondly, of course, that will come with attendant consequences, implications to the Nigerian economy in terms of job creation, added revenue, and more importantly, it will then lead to reduction in the flare volumes. So I think, yes, we're on the right path. In terms of the numbers, it's difficult to put in a number to what we expect, because, of course, a lot of commercial arrangements need to be put in place. But if the awardees then do kickstart, you then begin to see more players in the midstream. And that means, in addition to the points I've mentioned, there will be more gas available for other activities, to the power sector, industrial sector. And of course, historically, we've been fighting, or we've been having the challenges of lack of access to gas. So this is a win-win for the country and for the investors themselves. So I think this is a good path for us.
But then there's the challenges about the possibility of these companies that would be given the opportunity to kickstart the program to have the required capacity and wherewithal to roll with it, most especially in the areas of generation and distribution. Because the NUPRC announced when they issued the letters of award to about 42 of the companies and entities that were actually deemed for the successful bid, they issued a certificate to them, but then there were criteria that they looked at. But you've been an expert. I'd like you to just take us through the details of what you believe would have gone into the screening of these companies to determine their capacity and, of course, their eligibility to manage these projects.
Well, as you rightly mentioned, first thing is the technical capacity and the competence to be able to manage those projects. And we're aware that a couple of companies bidded individually, while a couple also formed consortiums to come together to deploy resources and capacities. So I think the NUPRC naturally would have looked at their competence, their capacity, their track records, and more importantly, for those that are forming alliances with other companies, either local or foreign companies, making sure that those alliances actually bring in the right resources and capacities. Then secondly, it's the financing. The financing is key. So it's important to ensure that those entities have been set up in a way and the projects have been set up in a way to attract investments. The funding is key to this entire process. Without the funding, none of the projects can kickstart. So yes, there might be challenges for a few people, and you could imagine that of the 42 who've been awarded these, of all the 42 companies or entities that have come up, not all might be able to progress at the same speed. But at least we are sure that even if it's a third that can start moving as speedily as possible, then I think that's progress. Really, it's really about being able to assess the financing. And of course, the last point is about the commercials of the gas pricing. And I think the government is gradually beginning to look at the pricing, because if the prices at which these guys can sell this gas molecules, it's not attractive, then of course it will affect the bankability of the project. So working with the government, I think it's an ongoing conversation. We need to keep looking at the gas pricing to make sure that the pricing is such that incentivizes these investments at the same time that is affordable for the end users who need to buy the gas.
And of course, we're aware that the conclusion of the bidding process is just about a phase away. But then when we consider those who qualify for the program and those who do not meet the criteria that you have actually highlighted, what happens when the preferred bidders that are actually chosen fail to meet the terms and conditions stipulated by the RFP?
Yeah. So as is the case here, and what typically happens, and which the case here, a couple of the companies will be set out as reserve bidders. So what does that mean? Reserve bidders they will be identified as people who potentially met the criteria, but they were not shortlisted at the first round. So they will be set out as reserve bidders. And then for the entities who are the preferred bidders, they will be expected to meet their conditions. If company A or company B is unable to meet its conditions, then it will be pulled out from that process. Then one or two companies from the reserved bidders will then be bumped up the chain and then become a preferred bidder to the extent to which is able to meet those the key conditions, including being able to get in place the commercial arrangements and being able to pay the fees. So that's what happens. So we have the reserve bidders in place. So to the extent to which any of the preferred bidders is unable to chest out to meet its conditions, the reserve bidders will be bumped up to become preferred bidders. So that process is already ongoing.
So at that stage, is it possible to have maybe one or two companies merge together to support each other and pool resources together to meet, and most especially the financial criteria of what is needed for them to scale through the hurdle?
Yes, in terms of what is possible, it is always possible. And some people would say it's always preferable to have, people coming together to, those synergies to come together. But it's also about chemistry. Sometimes it's something that must happen naturally. Each of the entities need to do the appropriate due diligence and to make sure company A and company B have the right chemistry and can work together. So that's something we need to be very careful about. When you force two companies to come together, to work together, more often than not, they run into problems midway downstream. So it's important in it for them to look at what each of the parties is bringing to the table. Then if they think they can make those collaborations, they can then piggyback off the strengths of each other. So yes, collaborations are always welcome, whether at this stage or subsequently in the future, they can always continue to collaborate.
Now, there were actually a series of focused engagements with relevant stakeholders, talk about the investors, development agencies, oil and gas producers, technology producers, and of course, financial institutions were actually brought into the potpourri of what is needed in terms of the discussions. Now, there's this argument, would you prefer more allocations go to indigenous companies than their foreign counterparts who may have better credentials, may have the better machinery, and have more financial or capital base to deliver the project? Because there's always been the issue of having indigenous companies in a particular jurisdiction assume certain important levels of businesses and take control of businesses within that locality than have foreign counterparts come in, which in a way might not really generate the needed funds, or the operation might not really be in tandem with what the government's projections are. So when we put indigenous companies together beside foreign companies or international companies that may have the capacity, which would you say should take the preference in terms of allocations?
I think that's where the regulators need to be careful in terms of that balancing act. Yes, it goes without saying, the only way you can be proficient in a thing is to do it. So we must encourage indigenous companies to participate. And the only way they can participate and gain the competence is by doing it. So that goes without saying. But at the same time, the oil and gas sector is a very technical sector. In addition to having the technical expertise, you need to have the managerial expertise and then being able to attract financing. All this requires you to have a good track record. Now, to what extent do these indigenous companies have that track record? Thankfully, over the last decade or so, particularly with the involvement of the NCDMB, the Nigerian Content Board, we've seen a good number of Nigerian companies ramp up capacity. And that's a good thing. So we have a good number of indigenous companies who do have the capacity. But then it also depends at the level at which you're playing. It depends on the assets you've been given. So when indigenous companies objectively determine that they might not on their own have the capacity to push through, the prudent thing to do is to form alliances with foreign counterparts who can then infuse capacity, either in terms of the technical expertise or managerial expertise, or even the financing. So the collaborations, as I mentioned, and the synergies are equally important. But yes, indigenous companies must continue to be encouraged, but not at the risk of jeopardizing the projects, because it's critical that the projects are allowed to pull through. So the regulators then have their work cut out for them to ensure that when they are running the entire due diligence process for the indigenous companies, they can identify if they really do have the capacities. And if they do not, they can be encouraged to form the right partnerships with technical partners who have the capacity to be able to pull through.
Mm. Well, with the conclusion of the bidding process, how optimistic are you that this initiative will actually bear more economic fruit rather, for the country? And for the government, in terms of the role it should play, how do you think it can ensure that this program is a success?
So for me, this is like a weight loss journey. The only way to start it is to start it. You might start slow, but you must take the first step. As long as you're taking one step after the other, one foot after the other, then there's progress. So I think we've made progress. We have preferred bidders have emerged. What now remains is for us to ensure, and the regulators to ensure they can meet the requirements for them to then begin to produce and then to pump in those investments that we need. So yes, I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic. Timelines historically we are not very I'm not sure the word to use. We do not always meet the timelines that are set. But I think, of course, we need to take into consideration the operational environment in Nigeria and the way the economy is moving at the moment. Attracting financing is not easy at any level whatsoever. So I think the regulators might need to cut some of these operators some slack to enable them to run through the period and then to grow. But I think, inexorably with time, I think this is progress. Even if out of the 42, a third, even if a quarter are able to do something concrete with what these the resources they've been given, that I think it's a step in the right direction.
So when you say that the government should cut them some slacks, are you talking about some sort of incentives or some sort of encouragement in a way that gives them an enabling environment to progress with the operation of the program? Because I like to find out when you say cut them some slack, what do you really mean?
Yes, like I always say, it must continue to be an ongoing conversation. The operating environment globally, it's increasingly more difficult, and more so in Nigeria. You can see what has happened with the devaluation of the naira, and a couple of these companies will then have a lot of capex and opex spends, which will be pegged to the dollar. So that challenge is there. The liquidity crisis is still there. The gas pricing challenge is still there. Then the operational challenges in terms of operating in the Niger Delta, for example, is still there. So I think there has to be an open channel of continued communication between the operators and the government. The government must be sensitive to understand the needs and the requirements of these operators. Not that they will be lazy in regulating them, or not that they will let them, just not do what they're supposed to do. No, but at the same time, we must take into consideration that there are a whole lot of external factors that are affecting productivity. So those factors need to be taken into consideration, either in terms of the timelines being given to them or the requirements being imposed on the operators. Because if the operating environment becomes too harsh for them to operate, what will simply happen is that they will pull out and then begin to seek out more favorable jurisdictions, which we've seen happen in the last couple of years.
So finally, before I let you go, Chukwuemeka, in the process whereby these companies have been allocated their sites to work on, and probably during the course of operations, probably next 3, 4, 5, 6 months, we discover that they have not been meeting targets or the operations have not been optimal. Does the government have the prerogative right to pull out that contract, to probably seize their license and substitute them with some other company that may be willing and has what it takes to give the required numbers and optimize the operation within that field?
Yes, in the issuance of the licenses or permits, each of the permits or licenses will come with the terms and conditions, including the timelines. So if an operator is unable to meet its conditions within the prescribed timelines, if the consequence as set out in the permit is to revoke the permit or the license, then the government has the right to do so. But again, as I mentioned, it's important to when those channels of communication are open and the government understands why they are not meeting those challenges. It could be a function of lack of capacity. It could be a function of delays that justifiably the blame could not be put on the operator. Then I think that conversation can be had as to extensions. Yes, there can always be the possibility of extensions of timelines in particular to enable them to meet the conditions. But that's if external factors have objectively stopped them from performing. But if the government then checks and sees it's a function of capacity or inability to actually then ramp up and then get to where they're supposed to get to, then of course, unfortunately, the right thing would have to be done, which would be to take away the licenses or the permits from them and grant them to people who have demonstrated, better capacity to work with the permits.
Okay, Chukwuemeka Osuji, partner Olaniwun Ajayi, LP, thank you so much for joining us on Business Edge.
Thank you very much.